Hi, and welcome to the next of our webinars, which is funded through the Grow My SME programme. Today we'll be looking at returning from furlough. So furlough, this new word that's kind of come about in the last sort of 12 months. Certainly, I think most of us now know exactly what it refers to. But today we're joined by Kelly and Gina from Humber HR people, and we'll be talking through returning from furlough and how that can be integrated into a workplace. First of all, I just want to talk about questions. So we do want as many questions as we can. We do try and answer as many as we possibly can. So if you do have any questions throughout today, do please put them into the question section. You should see that on your dashboard in front of you. I suggest you put those in as and when they come to you. We've got a 2-hour session today, and we'll make sure that we answer those throughout the session. So we have got plenty of time at the end to answer any questions, so do put those in. We will be having a break sometime during today, get a cup of coffee and things like that, so that will take place at some point during today. So without further ado, I'll pass you on to Kelly and Gina, who will take you through to today's session. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kelly Calv. I'm the HR Director for Humber HR People, and we basically provide HR support for local businesses within the area. This is my colleague Gina Fleming. She's one of our HR consultants, and today we're going to be talking about different aspects that you need to consider when returning people from furlough. So we move to the next slide. We're just going to be touching on things like taking stock, so really looking at what the impact has been on your business and how that is going to impact your staff and things like terms of employment. Okay, we'll be looking at sort of considering the actual return to work, so things that you need to do before people return to work and when they actually return to work, touching on well-being, mental health and the type of support you should be giving your staff, and then also having a little look at the sort of the future and things that you need to be mindful of moving forwards. So as Peter's already said, if you do have any questions as we go through this, please pop it into the questions box and you can pick those up at the end. Okay, so first of all, just wanted to do a quick recap on furlough and the job retention scheme, just to make sure that you are doing what you need to be doing to allow you to claim. Okay, so the job retention scheme allows you to claim up to $2,500 per month, or 80% of the wage cost for employees, and that was between the months of March and August. From the 1st of September, that amount has actually dropped down to 70%. So employers will now need to top up the remaining 10% or top up to full pay if that's the agreement that you've had in place with staff. From October, that amount is going to drop down to 60%. So again, you're going to need to top up to the 80% or to 100% if that's the agreement that you've had with staff. Okay, so it's something that you do need to be mindful of. In order to claim, you have to have had 3 weeks consecutive claim periods put in prior to the 30th of June. Okay, so obviously the scheme came in originally in March, it was then extended. So in order for you to utilise the scheme in this extended period, you need to put in a claim by the 30th of June, or you need to have had furloughed people by the 30th of June and submitted your claim by the 31st of July. Okay, to the next slide. There's a bit of a delay with slides, so do bear with us. The amount that you can claim for in any period starting from the 1st of July cannot exceed the maximum amount of number of people that you've claimed for previously. So for example, if you've put in a claim for 20 people and then a claim for 30 people and then sort of a third claim for 50 people, from July you cannot exceed the amount of 50 people in any one claim. Okay. Moving forward, you can now use flexible furloughs. What that basically means is that you can allow people to come back to work on a part-time basis. So if you had somebody who worked full-time, you can now bring them back 3 days a week and furlough them 2 days a week. Okay, it's really important that any agreements that you have with staff, you do have in writing. Okay, so anything that you discuss, agree, you put it in writing. With regards to being eligible for the grant, as I say, you must have put it in writing and you must have agreement in place. So if you haven't got something within your contract of employment that allows you to furlough your staff, you should have put something in place to say that they agree to it. They don't necessarily have to respond in writing to say they're accepting that. You just have to have something to say that you've notified them in writing. So potentially they've had the opportunity to challenge it if they want to. Okay, you need to keep all written records for 5 years. And what I would say is, with regards to kind of tracking hours that people have worked, hours that people have been on furlough, any conversations that you've had with staff around anything to do with furlough and the job retention scheme, make sure you have a written record. Because if you are challenged on anything going forwards, obviously this is all kind of unprecedented times for us, but the more you can demonstrate you've behaved in a reasonable way and you've got written records, the better stead that you will be, okay? So taking stock, okay, really, we're talking to a lot of clients at the moment and have been over the last couple of months, really looking at, you know, the impact that COVID has had on their business. We can move to the next slide, please. So the things you need to start thinking about is, you know, what has been that major impact on your business, and how has that changed kind of the product that you're offering, the services that you're being able to offer? How has it impacted your customers, your clients, your supply chain? And what impact ultimately is that having on the people that you employ? So this is going to be things like, you know, the amount of people that you employ, the particular job roles that those people have, the hours that they work, locations that they work within, you know, the amount that you're able to pay them. So if there is an impact on any of these factors within your workforce, you really need to start thinking about, okay, how do you manage that? You know, I think that there's this thing that, you know, the pandemic has impacted everybody in huge ways and businesses in huge ways. But the thing that still stands is that employment law is still employment law. So you have to go through a process. You have to follow what's within your contract. You have to abide by statutory law. If you don't, you will get yourself in trouble. So as much as these changes are happening, you need to make sure that you're actually following a set process and procedures that's within the law and you're behaving reasonably and fairly, okay? So I think the main things that we kind of just want to cover off today, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because there are other seminars that kind of are covering this off, but just to kind of give you some awareness of what you need to be mindful of. If you do find that you're in a situation where you're thinking, okay, I've got people that are still on furlough and it's not looking like I'm going to be able to bring them back, so it's potentially going to be a redundancy situation, or, you know, I do have to make changes to my workforce, so, you know, reducing job roles, changing job roles, and so potentially a restructure, okay? So when we talk about restructure and redundancies, it potentially can lead to a form of dismissal, okay? So we're talking about the reduction of roles, changing of roles, a closure of a business entirely, or even a closure of a workplace. So if your business has several different locations and one of those is closing because you don't need perhaps to meet the particular volume you did prior to the pandemic, then, you know, you could be looking at a redundancy situation. If you are in a redundancy situation, the key thing here is consultation, okay? Now, the law stipulates that if you have 20 or more redundancies, you do have to consult, okay? So the guidelines are 20 to 99, you have to consult for a period of 30 days before you can confirm that first dismissal. If it's 100 or more, it's 45 days before you can confirm that first dismissal, okay? You have to do that. You cannot do anything before you've gone through that period of consultation. If it's less than 20, there's no requirement to collectively consult, but there is a requirement to show that you followed a reasonable and fair process and you have entered into some form of consultation with those individuals. So we generally advise people that that length of time is probably going to be about 2 weeks, and that will enable you to invite somebody to an individual consultation meeting, confirm to them that they're potentially at risk of redundancy, explore the reasons why, and then give them the opportunity to come back with suggestions, okay? So you still need to be doing that through a consultation process, even if it is less than 20 redundancies. So it's one thing that you do need to be mindful of. So the things that consultation has to cover, I've sort of touched on, is, you know, ways to avoid redundancies, the reasons for redundancies. You need to explain to somebody, you know, the reason why they've potentially been selected for redundancy, and you need to follow a fair selection process, okay? So when we talk about fair selection processes, it means something that's not discriminatory. So you need to ensure that the reasons why somebody's being selected for redundancy is based on their skills and experience, their performance within the role. You can technically use something like attendance, but again, be really mindful of just using raw attendance data. You need to go through it and make sure that there isn't anything in there relating to pregnancy and maternity or a disability, because if you do use those days against somebody, you're potentially going to fall into disability discrimination or maternity discrimination. So you really do need to be careful when you start thinking about the reasons why you're selecting people for redundancy. Okay, you need to open up and, as I say, give people the opportunity to make suggestions of how they can sort of keep dismissals to a minimum, or ways that they can kind of reduce the effects on people, so potentially retraining and moving people to other roles. So you have to make sure that that consultation process is meaningful. Okay, that's the real key to it. It has to be meaningful. Once you've sort of got to a situation where you have decided, okay, yeah, we've been through a consultation process and we're making redundancies, you need to be aware that you have to pay redundancy pay if somebody has over 2 years service, and that they are entitled to a notice period. Okay, so they're entitled to contractual and statutory notice period. So if somebody has 8 years service, for example, but they have a contractual notice period of 4 weeks, the statutory notice period will supersede that. So you will actually need to give them 8 weeks notice or 8 weeks notice pay. Okay, so these are the things that you really need to consider when you're looking at your timelines and thinking about, I need to restructure my business, or I need to make redundancies, because of the financial impact your business has had on it, that you have to abide by these redundancy pay, contractual notice periods and pay. Okay. If somebody does move into an alternative job, so if you are in a situation where you've had to reduce the size of your workforce, but you have other new roles created, for example, or sort of new types of roles where new skills are required, if you have somebody that's at risk of redundancy and they've moved into one of those new jobs, they are entitled to a 4-week trial period, so you do need to be mindful of that. And then at the end of that 4-week trial period, if they don't accept that role, they are then entitled to take their redundancy as set out originally. People are also entitled to paid time off to look for new work while still employed with you. Now, the legislation around this stipulates reasonable paid time off, but there really isn't any information on what is reasonable. That you will need to use your kind of a bit of common sense and your judgment on that as to what you believe reasonable is. But again, keep records of that so you can justify, if somebody's taking extreme amounts of time off, that, the reasons why you've decided you're not going to pay them for any further time off. Okay. The other element here is kind of changing terms and conditions of employment. So if you're in a situation where perhaps you're not making redundancies, but you are looking at sort of changing the hours or the days or the tasks within somebody's job, or you're looking at, you perhaps need to look at reducing salaries because of your overhead costs or changing locations. If these changes are going to be permanent changes to the contract of employment, you need to make sure that, again, you are following statutory law and that you are making sure that there is a clause within your contract that enables you to make these changes. Okay, so you should have something within your contract that says, as an employer, you're able to make reasonable changes. Again, and this is the key, these have to be reasonable changes. If you make changes that are deemed unreasonable, you could still leave yourself open to constructive dismissal. So somebody could say, well, actually, you've put me in a situation where it's not tenable for me to continue in this job role, so therefore I've been constructively dismissed. Or if you're making changes which potentially are in breach of your contract, it could lead to unfair dismissal. So these are all the things that you need to consider when you're changing people's terms of employment. If it's temporary changes that you're looking at, then an option may be to kind of consult with them and seek agreement, and then have something in place that, for a temporary period of time, they are going to have, reduced hours or reduced days. But so you do need to seek their agreement, and you do need to kind of consult with them and get something in writing that says they agree and accept, and that there is a time frame given to that. Now it's kind of a great time to look at your policies and procedures and update those. Okay, some of these you should be doing anyway in kind of response to the changes that we've seen, so in particular absence policies. So you really need to refine you know, how you're going to manage sickness absence. So in particular, if you've got a workforce that is now working remotely, you might want to have a look at your sort of your general sickness absence reporting procedures and look at, you know, how are they then going to be reporting absence, and the kind of how you're going to do the touch base, the back to work interviews, that type of thing. When it comes to COVID-19 related absence, you really need to start setting out the processes that people need to follow and what they're entitled to. So either having that within your policies and procedures, or having it very, very clearly signposted to government websites so that everybody really understands what it is they're entitled to and what their responsibilities are. So the things you need to start thinking about is if somebody needs to self-isolate, what does that look like? Okay, now the reasons for self-isolation, you know, we've got track and trace happening, we've got people who are traveling, we've got potential school closures. If the kids get back to school, I've seen my Facebook page is inundated with back to school pictures, so you know, fingers crossed we're moving in that direction. But you know, we all know that the kids are in bubbles, and what happens when one of those kids ends up with a sniffle and a cold, because we're moving into that season now, and you know, we end up having to pull our kids out of school and going into that self-isolation process. So you know, what are going to be your measures within your absence reporting procedures, and how are you going to manage that? And also then the other side of thing is kind of the caring responsibilities. So people still have, or may still have, those caring responsibilities for, you know, family members who have health concerns, who are still shielding, who haven't been able to kind of get back into the norm, if we can even call it that, or the norm that is at the moment, to full capacity. So it's really, you need to think about, you know, how are you going to support these members of staff, and how are you going to manage that? So again, be really, really clear on what people are going to be entitled to in relation to statutory sick pay. So if somebody is self-isolating and they have a GP note or a 111 note, then that entitles them to statutory sick pay from day one for up to 2 weeks. Obviously, as an employer, you can only claim back up to 2 weeks. So I guess one period of isolation of up to 2 weeks. After that, then employers are going to have to foot the bill. So this is the other thing that you need to think about. You know, how often is somebody going to need to self-isolate? If people have the ability to work from home and they need to self-isolate, then obviously they can still continue to work, and you wouldn't need to kind of look at the kind of the SSP element and the self-certifying. But if people don't have that ability to work from home, you really need to set out you know, what process you're going to follow and what they need to do. Okay. With regards to annual leave, again, you really need to start thinking about this, and this is something that a lot of our clients are talking to us about, is, you know, how do they manage that? The statutory law changed in that we can now allow people to carry over their statutory holiday entitlement for the next 2 years, okay? And that's only if they've been impacted and unable to take their leave because of COVID-19. So that, again, is going to be your judgment call as an employer. And you need to kind of decide, okay, can they or should they carry over any leave? A lot of our clients are kind of coming to us and saying, you know, how can I manage it? I don't really want people carrying over leave. Our advice has been, go out to staff and talk to them and really ask them, you know, when are you planning on taking your leave? Let's get it booked in. Okay, so you have a real clear understanding of, you know, where people are going to be and what leave they're taking sort of between now and the end of your leave year. And then if obviously you get to the scenario where there is leave to be carried over, you can agree that with individuals. The other thing that you need to be looking at, and do need a policy on it, is a home working policy. Again, this is, you know, you might be in the realms of you've got staff that are still working remotely and you're going to continue doing that. So it's a really, really good practice to have a home working policy in place. And the other side of it is if you do bring people back and then we're thrown into lockdown again and they need to go back into working from home or working remotely, having it set out as to how you're going to manage home working is kind of going to be key. Again, from talking to clients, you know, we've had people that have had potential issues arise when it comes to things like, you know, equipment. So, you know, what am I responsible for providing? The answer is everything. You need to make sure that somebody's set up to work from home, and not only that, is that they're working safely from home. So things like workstation assessments, that care of duty still resides with you as an employer, regardless of whether they're working from home. So you do need to be asking those people to be doing some kind of self-assessment, so that if they are, sitting there hunched over, using their ironing board to prop their laptop on, and they're going to get backache, you need to be aware of it and make sure that you're putting in preventative measures and providing them with an adequate desk, for example. Okay, the other thing that's really important is GDPR. So obviously people are taking work data, which is potentially customer data, employee data, they're taking that home. They need to be fully aware of what their requirements are within the GDPR realms, and any consequences of kind of data breaches. Okay, so you really need to be educating on them on that, and kind of having it set out as to what the consequences are if they do breach GDPR. Okay, communication is really, really important. So how are you going to communicate with these people? How are you going to keep them updated? How are you going to make sure that they're doing the work that you ask them to do, and how they then should be communicating with you? And then the other thing, the little bone of contention which keeps raising its head, is around expenses. So what are you going to allow your employees to claim? Again, this is it's kind of entirely up to you as to where you start this off. Because we've got clients that are sort of saying, well, actually, do you know what, I'm not going to allow them to claim back utility costs or internet costs because they're saving on their fuel costs because they're not having to commute into the office. So it's really how you decide to set the stance out, but be aware you might get pushback from staff who say, well, actually, my bills have increased significantly from work since I've been working from home. Okay, so just be aware there is a conversation that might come back to haunt you, but you really should be setting out from the outset as to what that expectation is and how you're going to manage it. Okay, flexible working is sort of still separate from home working. So a home working policy is really about the state of play when somebody works from home. Okay, and that can be whether they've requested to work from home or whether you've had to go into lockdown and you're requesting that they work from home. Flexible working, people still have the right and the statutory right to request flexible working. So if somebody just come to you and say, I want to put in a flexible working request because of childcare, and being a parent, I'm fully aware that actually childcare at the moment is still very restricted. So if people did have wraparound care, so they were dropping their kids off early or having their kids collected from school, that might still not be available for them at this point. So if somebody comes to you and says, I want to put in a flexible working request, they still have that statutory right to do so. And if they do, you are still required to follow a statutory process. Okay, what I would say is that at this time, support your staff as much as you can. Yes, we are, all expected to kind of return to work more and more now, but actually the support there around childcare isn't what it was prior to lockdown, especially with the wraparound care and the consistency of care. So just be mindful of that. And the other thing that you want to be looking at is your travel policy. So again, there's still, the starting point for this is travel is really should be only partaken in when it's essential. So if your staff need to go on essential journeys, okay. But actually it's how are you going to keep them safe when they're sort of traveling for business, and also what their responsibilities are. So you really need to set out what they're responsible for, and that there is a certain amount of ownership on them to make sure that they're following protocols and reducing the risk to themselves. The other thing that you need to be looking at, and again, there are sort of separate webinars on this, so I'm only going to touch on this because it's a huge area, is the health and safety aspect, the PPE requirements, risk assessments. So you need to make sure that you've got all of this in place, and there is lots of information that is signposted on the government websites that can kind of help you do that. Okay, so if you got to the point where you've kind of looked at your business, you kind of a bit clearer around, okay, what does the structure of my organisation look like? I kind of know what the job roles look like. I kind of know what my terms and conditions of employment are going to look like. I've reviewed all my policies and procedures. So I've got that piece done. Now it's the actual staff, okay? You now need to understand what the circumstances are for every single one of your employees, okay? And we cannot stress how important this is. You really should be, if you haven't done so already, and you've got staff that are still on furlough, or even staff that have come back into the workforce, you need to be making sure you are fully aware of everything that is going on for them, okay? So our best advice would be to conduct some kind of questionnaire or interview definitely, you know, over the phone, face to face if you can, but definitely over the phone, Zoom, and really kind of understand where they're at with their personal situations at the moment. Okay, so the kind of things you need to be asking and finding out is around, do they have any underlying health concerns? Have they got any conditions they were perhaps shielding with, or is there anything that's kind of happened between sort of the beginning of lockdown and now? So potentially pregnancy. So you need to make sure you're really fully aware of everything that's going on with that individual. Okay, you need to understand their family situation. So, you know, do they have children? What are the childcare arrangements? What's the potential of anything going wrong? What support do they need? Do they have any other caring responsibilities? So do they have responsibilities for other people within their lives where potentially things may go wrong, or they may need that bit of extra support? So you need to be aware of everything. You know, how are they going to travel to work? So again, you know, if they're using public transport, the reality is there's going to be delays because there is reduced numbers being able to use services at certain times. So how are you going to cater for that? How are you going to manage that? Is there any way you can sort of adjust their working day to help them and accommodate that? So you really need to understand everything around this individual, you know, and ask them, how are they feeling about the return to work? Is there anything that you need to know? Also, the other important thing here is around training and retraining. Potentially, some people have been out of the business since March. That is a long time to have been removed from your business and removed from your role. So, you know, look at what is the role and is there any training that they need to do in order to bring them back into the workplace. And then again, you know, as I said before, when are they planning on taking annual leave? So really make sure you understand when they're planning on taking that annual leave so that you can kind of map it into your business operations and know kind of when you're going to have staff available. Okay, so in summary, before anybody returns, you know, really take stock, ensure that your terms and conditions really reflect any changes that you need to make, that your policies and procedures are up to date, that you've conducted that return to work questionnaire for each employee and you've got a written record of that, that you've written to your employees to confirm that they're returning from furlough and whether or not you're going to be engaging sort of flexible furlough or whether they're just returning, and that you have a written record of everything, and you really need to be keeping these written records for 5 years. Okay, so make sure you have them, make sure you keep them somewhere safe, because if anything does happen and you get challenged on any of this, you can demonstrate that you have followed reasonable and fair processes. Okay, so before the actual return to work, some of the things that you need to be thinking about. The physical workplace, okay, so again, there is lots of information out around the physical workspace, but you really need to be ensuring, and I'm sure we've all been out and about and we've seen it in pubs, in restaurants, in public spaces, you know, there should be a one-way system, okay? You should be sort of introducing social distancing measures of 1 metre plus. You can use things like screens and segregation units. You should have a reduction of sort of office space, or if you can't physically reduce it, make sure that you're using every other desk space, for example. There should be lots of sanitisation stations and lots of cleaning protocols in place. I can't stress enough with any of this the importance of making sure that you communicate it well to staff and that they fully understand what their responsibilities are. We've seen with some of our clients on this return to work that people are getting into situations where they're having to kind of manage and potentially discipline staff for not following these safety protocols, okay? From a health and safety point of view, the care of duty does lie with you as the employer, so you are the one responsible for making sure that your staff are safe. So if you have an employee that, you know, is not observing social distancing measures, and so I've had a client that had this problem, you know, and they're ultimately putting other people at risk, you need to take action, but you need to demonstrate that you've advised that person of the requirement to social distance and the consequences of not doing so, okay? So you do need to have this very, very clearly laid out, and they do need to be aware of what the consequences are going to be if they don't follow your guidance on this. Travel, again, as we've sort of touched upon, you need to be clear on to who's using public transport and kind of who's coming into work in their own car. And it's really understanding if people are comfortable with this, and making sure that you can make allowances for delays due to safety. So if somebody's perhaps in a customer services role and they need to be there at 8 o'clock, you really need to be exploring with them the reality of, can they guarantee they're going to get there for 8 o'clock, and if they can't, what's going to happen? Okay, you really should be penalising them if they're delayed because of the travel system, because we all know it's a bit of a, what's going to happen at the beginning of each day. They don't know whether they're going to be able to catch the bus, the train, they can't rely upon that. So you just need to be aware of what you're going to do and how you're going to manage this should it start to impact kind of your business operations. And remote working considerations, so say as we've already touched on this, if your employees are working remotely, or I think the other thing we're starting to see more and more of is more of a blended approach. So I think at the beginning of lockdown, people were quite, wow, this is great, I'm working from home, I've got some extra hours back in my day because I'm not having to commute, and I don't have to take a shower. But that, I think, has then got on top of people, and we're very much seeing more and more that actually when people have been stuck in their houses, especially if they have other family members that are also trying to work, they've had the kids from school, and so people are now sort of saying, well, actually this remote working is great, but I also want to be able to get into the office. So you really need to think about how you're going to manage that blended approach. So again, kind of look at staggered approaches, perhaps putting in rotas in for people to book into office space within within your office if you can do that, but really just how you're going to keep people connected and engaged. Again, make sure you do your risk assessments with home working, and that they have the right equipment, and that you've agreed what utilities and things you're going to be picking up from a cost point of view. Again, health and safety PPE. The safety is paramount. It's your responsibility as an employer to make sure that you have everything in place, okay? And I think you need to be thinking about the long term. So really do think about, not just the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months, but actually going into next year. What do you need to provide with your staff, and have you got enough of it? And when it comes to things like face coverings, for example, try, with my green warrior coming out, try to avoid the one usable stuff. You really want the reusable stuff. But again, if you're going to be issuing that to staff, make sure that you're making it very clear what their responsibilities are, and sort of keeping it clean, keeping it in a state that they can actually reuse it, and sort of what the consequences are of them not doing that. So you really need to have everything really set out very clearly in your policies and procedures. Okay, as I say, there's lots of government guidance that you can access. So www.gov.uk, there are loads and loads of handbooks, pointers, guidance that are kind of set out for every industry, every type of work environment. So office environments, factory environments, retail environments, that give you in-depth guidance on how to manage your workplace. Some of these are sort of 60, 70 pages long, but they're worth the read. So go there, have a read through, really fully understand what it is you need to be doing to have in place within your workplace when you're bringing people back from furlough. Okay. With regards to kind of advice on the employment side of things, if you visit www.acas.co.uk, again, there is lots and lots of advice there around everything that we've touched on today. So redundancies, restructures, changing terms and conditions of employment, holiday entitlements, how to manage sickness absence in relation to COVID, how to manage sickness absence in relation to other illnesses. So everything that you need is going to be in there. So, please do use these reference points. But I guess our overarching advice with sort of anything that we've covered off in this first section this morning is that if you are going to be making changes to terms and conditions of employment, if you are going to be making redundancies, if you are going to be going through any kind of restructures, you really do need to seek advice, because you could potentially leaving yourself open to risk of sort of constructive or unfair dismissal claims or discrimination claims. Okay, so it is important that you seek advice either through these websites or through other means, but our advice would be to get that advice before you start on any kind of journey through those. Okay, if anybody has any questions on anything that we've covered in this first section, please do put them in the questions section and we can cover those off at the end in our Q&A. We're going to take a short break now for 10 minutes. So if you would like to kind of grab a coffee, have a comfort break, we can then reconvene at 10:50.
Good morning and welcome back. I hope you took that time to have a bit of a comfort break and get your cup of coffee to see you through the morning. So now we're going to go, Kelly obviously was talking about a lot of facets and a lot of factors that you really need to consider when bringing your employees back to work. So I wanted to show this screen to show that this is what we're trying to avoid. What we don't want is we don't want to bring all our people back, be completely unprepared and to not set them up for success. So the next section that we're going to go through is we're really going to talk about the actual return to work. So looking at having that people strategy in place, having that plan, and then making sure that we are setting everyone up for success, that we have that nice smooth transition to basically avoid what you're seeing on the screen. We want to make sure that all of our employees are feeling comfortable when they return and that they slip straight back into business operations to make that a nice smooth transition as your people come back. So in terms of the actual return to work, you need to have a look at a time frame. So what Kelly was talking about is now is a good opportunity to really look at your business as a whole, to really define exactly what it is that you want to achieve, the goals, the targets, the focus. If you've had any changes in this pandemic around diversification of products or services or changes that you've made, you want to really look at what it is that you're wanting to achieve. So you have your business model. So you looked at how you're going to do the workspace, how you're going to make people socially distance in their working environment, and you want to look at when to start. So if you haven't already started to bring people back now and you're still planning on that time frame, that's what you want to start making that plan. So you want to take your business strategy, you identify the skills and the tasks of the people that you want them to do and who will fit those roles. It's important that as you're making a plan, and it was touched upon earlier, is there needs to be that justification, a fair process, that fair reason in order for who is coming back and when. Because it could be that you're not in a situation to bring all of your furloughed employees back all at the same time, as well as you're not sure how they're going to work, whether they're going to continue to remote work, whether you're taking that blended approach. So you really want to identify those individuals. So the people who you feel you need to come back and they need to probably go back into the workspace, whether those people can do the home working, whether you're actually going to look at doing that flexible furlough or whether they're going to come back part-time and you're going to stagger those returns. So this, you want to basically work backwards. So you have your time frame as to when you want the person and then allowing time for notice, because you probably can't just phone people up and say, hey, can you come back to work tomorrow? You want to allow them time because they're not ready to come back. So there's this whole people plan and people strategy about actual how you're going to bring those individuals back to work. And you want to make it as smooth as possible and making allowing there to be time for you to plan, to get your everything in order, to make sure that you are ready for those people to come back. You know exactly what they're going to do, what their focus is, what their targets are, whether there's any training involved. So we're going to now look at that in a little bit more detail. Communication is key and has been throughout this whole process. So hopefully there's been regular contact with those people on furlough. It's just because they're not in the business doesn't mean they're not part of your business. So even in this planning stage, it's now a good time to keep that regular contact or pick up the phone and have those conversations. Kelly spoke about having that questionnaire to go through that. But even now, if you haven't been doing so, having those weekly catch-ups with the team, so bringing them in just so they can touch base and have those conversations remotely using video conferencing and things like that, making sure that they get the communication from the top. Be honest about how COVID-19 has affected the business. The more they know about the situation, the more they're going to build that trust and you're going to build that rapport with your team. You know, they want to come into this situation with their eyes wide open. You want their commitment, their dedication. So communicate this information, share it. That then will open up them to start thinking about work, to start getting in the mindset of getting ready to return. And you can share the goals and the focus of the way the business is heading, the changes that you've made, the update in services or the new products that you may be doing or change to your delivery, whatever the situation is. This information is really instrumental for your employees to really understand how and where the business is going. So Also share the information of if there's any team changes. So we talked about restructure. You potentially have or are thinking about restructure and any changes that may impact your individual teams, and seek their feedback as well. Your employees are on the ground. They're the ones doing the day-to-day tasks. They will also be able to give you insight into how they're feeling and what their concerns are about the return, so that you can then also have this as part of your plan. You can take on board what they're saying, see if there's anything that you've not thought of that they may have thought of. We know that people talk, and people of other businesses and other companies, they share what they're doing, whether it's they've done these screens and they have to wear face coverings, or they don't because they do something different. But having that information will help you better prepare for their return. And you can also update and implement those changes. And you can even spitball those ideas with them and say, this is what you're thinking about, this is what you're hoping to change, this is where the business is going. But I can't stress enough, and I'll probably continue to talk about communication throughout this session, but even just having those that short FaceTime or that conversation with your employee about how they're doing, and just so that they have someone to talk to, that's someone from the business, means a lot, particularly when people have been out of work for such a significant period of time. Don't underestimate that period of time. For a lot of people, it will feel like they're returning to work brand new. So with that in mind, I want to talk about induction. When you bring a new hire into the business, it is about setting them up for success. It is about making sure that you give them as much information as possible for them to feel at ease as soon as possible. You want them to feel comfortable. You want them to be able to slip into that role, to get up to speed, to know the processes, to know what they're doing as soon as possible. I am not saying that we are going to need to train everyone to do their job, but the anxiety and the concern of going from being out of the business to coming into the business for such a significant period of time may mean that actually they have that conscious feeling, and they may stagger around and not really know what they're doing for a period of time. So we have an opportunity to jump in there first, to have a plan in place, to create that induction, to really ease that concern. And for us as a business, to make sure that we have the allowances to know that it may take a little bit of time for them to get up and up to speed. So when you're thinking about people returning from furlough, think as if they're new hires. Set them up for that success. It may be that a site or an office familiarization process needs to happen. So whether you're walking through, if you've implemented a one-way system, if you've changed the desk layout or the furniture layout, if you've made it a hot desking scenario and there's a booking process, whatever the new situation of the physical workspace may be, it will probably be worthwhile having that familiarization discussion, tour, or chat with your employees. Policy changes and updates. Kelly spoke about a lot of policies that will need to be updated if they haven't already been so because of COVID-19. And obviously a lot of government guidance has caused changes and things have changed. So think about all of those policy changes and updates. Have the paperwork ready. It's maybe an opportunity for when you're thinking about bringing people back. What can you send to your employees in advance? What can they read up on? What documents can we send them for them to have a read of, to see the updates, to see the changes? Any policy changes and updates, your employees should be made aware of them. Yes, we talked about a consultation process. That process will still need to happen. But any documentation, if you're doing any temporary changes or anything like that, is good to be able to try and provide things in advance. Training. So when you have new hires, you tend to do some new hire training. So is there anything that's happened recently that actually now is an opportunity for people to refresh on when they return to work? Is there things that they can do differently? Or is there a new training that has been implemented around health and safety or around the new process in the office because of the social distancing? Whatever training there might be, this is also an opportunity to start scheduling or planning for your employees when they return, to do that training. It could be they could do it in advance, or it could be that you need to allow time for when they return in order to get up to speed in this area. Documentation. We talked about documentation being key and information being kept for 5 years because of the guidance from the government. But the documentation is really important to show that you have taken the time to go through the necessary key information for your employees. The policy changes, have them signed to confirm they understand and they know the changes. We don't want to be in a situation where we are having to go down a disciplinary route in order for them to have failed to follow a process, to not be taking health and safety regulations seriously. Whatever it is, we want to make sure that we take the time out to go through that paperwork, to get the documentation signed, and to keep track of it. And the key thing around all of this is support. The whole purpose of an induction is to support that person, to put that person at ease, to make sure that they transition very swiftly into their job. These people will know their job. They just will need to transition into the new environment or the changed environment. There may be minimal changes depending on your work situation prior to lockdown. But if you think about where you've been, you've had working prior, you've had working throughout lockdown, and now this is post-lockdown. So you have an opportunity to look at your working practices throughout this whole period. What was working before? What changed? Does it need improving? Did it work? And what are you doing afterwards? Is this how you're going to work long term, or is this still a temporary fix? So the support factor is crucial throughout this. And depending on how much communication you've had with your employees up to now, it is still potentially very daunting for them to come back into the business. So an induction process is straightforward, it sets them up for success, and it provides that additional support in order for them to return. So now we're at a point where you pretty much can pick up the phone and you're wanting to bring your employees back to work. So with the plan that you have in terms of your people strategy of how you're going to return people back to work, then you want to be communicating that time frame in that plan. We talked about when you're deciding who you're going to bring back and when, to make sure that you have fair reasons and that you justify that so you don't fall into the trap of discrimination. You would have already had the conversations around their personal circumstances. You know, what Kelly was saying in terms of finding out about how they're feeling, if they're shielding, if they're caring, what is their family situation. Knowing all of this information should have been factored into your timeframes and your plans. So when you're having that communication with your employees, talk to them about the plan. Now, if you're bringing back more than one person from furlough, you may want to explain who is returning at what time, because what you don't want to fall into a trap of, you've told one person, I'm going to bring you back in 2 weeks' time, and then they find out someone actually returned 2 days ago, and then that puts people on the back foot, and they'll think, hang on a minute, why wasn't I the one who was coming back? There should be justification and reason based on your business model and what skills and skills and knowledge that you require in order to move the business forward. So just prepare that time frame and plans and explain those reasons and changes. Communicate that induction process, especially about the day one expectations. Something as simple as telling them what time they need to arrive at the office or the site, because you don't want to make the assumption that they think they can just carry on as normal. And say, for example, your employee normally starts at 7 o'clock in the morning and you're normally in the office at 9. You don't want someone knocking around for 2 hours, not really knowing where they're going and what they're doing. So plan that induction process, set those expectations, and give them that information when you call them up. As I said before, think about what information you can provide in advance. So where you've got your employees, there may be policy updates, the training that we talked about. I know that one of our clients, they actually rearranged the office and they sent a kind of a walkthrough guide with photos of how the office was laid out. And they actually sent that to their employees in advance. So they already visually can start to see how the office has changed and what changes they've made. That sort of information is really important because already they will start to know what they're going to walk into. They'll have those first day jitters just as much as someone who's brand new to your business. So provide whatever information you can, whether it's the training, it's the paperwork, it's the updates, it's photos, video. Maybe someone wants to do a GoPro video around the office and show them what it is. You have an opportunity to be creative and imaginative with these things. And also take that time when you're talking to your employees about coming back to work to really reassure them about their safety and that you've taken and you've made changes and you've put those protocols in place. As we said, there's so much government guidance now about the for industry specific, so that the changes that that businesses are having to make and the reason what they're being put in, to have that conversation to reassure your employees that you wouldn't be requesting and asking them to come back if you were not ready from a safety perspective, and reassure them on that, because that will be the biggest thing. But be sure to actually listen to your employees, to listen to whether they want to come back, whether there's any concerns or restrictions that they are personally feeling. You should already be aware of this prior to actually saying, I'm ready for you to come back now, because you would have had that conversation around the questionnaire, you would have gone through that motion and you would have factored that into your timeframes and your plans. As for an example, if one of your employees says that their childcare commitments are still on hold up until the 1st of October, then you know what, you probably will be looking at bringing them back from the 1st of October when their childcare arrangements are in place. So this is always a subject that seems to be coming up because there's this refusal to return, or there's this belief that there is going to be a refusal to return. Now, if you've been communicating with your employees throughout the whole time, the chances of them refusing is probably minimal or very rare. And it's very important that if someone does share a concern or says they don't feel comfortable in order to refuse to, and in order to return to work, and that feels like a refusal, we need to understand why. We can't just make a snap judgment and go, well, you know, you're not coming back, then that's it. Well, actually, why? What are the reasons? If you've gone down that questionnaire process, you probably would have already talked about those reasons, and you may have already come up with solutions and compromises around that, whether it is the public transport that they're worried about getting, and if it's maybe a matter of changing the times, so instead of them traveling in rush hour, they may travel after rush hour. But don't make that snap judgment. Remember, there is a balance though. There is a balance between contractual and duty of care obligation. So if you think about it in terms of reasonable adjustments with disability discrimination, you put all of these reasonable adjustments in place, then you're fine. If the employee is still not happy at that point, then you know what? It is looking like that you'll probably part ways. But it is ultimately about making sure that you have put in those adjustments, that you have been reasonable, and that you have made those changes in order to make sure your employees are safe. So it is important to find that balance, to communicate. Like I say, if you have continued to communicate and you've shown everything that the company and the business has done, then an actual refusal will probably be very minimal. Should a refusal occur, you will need to follow your usual disciplinary practices. So whether the person doesn't show up on the day that you expect them and they're absent without leave, but with anything like this, communication and discussions with your employees is really important. And this is where you'll really get to understand exactly what their situation is. And we want to be bringing our people back. We don't want to be just saying goodbye, because the cost of hiring and going down a recruitment process in order to replace that person is more costly than actually having the discussion with them and maybe coming up with that solution. So I wanted to just at this point throw out some what if scenarios. So we are at this point, your people are returning. So there is a factor that you need to kind of consider, that actually what happens in these scenarios. Now, Kelly talks about making sure your policies are updated. So these kind of scenarios will change, and they may change and they may pop up and differ at different points. So Let's look at the travel and the quarantine situation. So great, we have these air bridges. Everyone starts jumping on a plane and going on holiday. However, who knew that this was going to be a turbulent time in terms of travel? Because actually now, what was an air bridge, which meant you didn't have to quarantine, all of a sudden, people are coming home from holiday and having to quarantine and self-isolate for 14 days. So, and if that's the situation, they're not necessarily going to get paid if they can't work from home. So this also is a changing goalpost every time. So now I heard on the news this morning that they're even looking at Greece. So even if you're on holiday in Greece, you might find that people will have to self-isolate if they put through again another restriction. So how is the business going to deal with that? Is it a matter of, you know what, if the person can actually work from home, it's no big deal, we don't need to worry about it? But what about business travel as well? So, and this could potentially be international travel. So when people are traveling abroad, and again, a similar situation happens, it's a non-isolation country, but then before they get back, the changes happen that they have to isolate when they come home. But they were purely out there for business reasons. But also we are seeing some local lockdowns now. So what happens in those situations if you have someone who manages a site in one of those areas and the expectation is they still need to go to that? So all of these kind of factors, we need to start thinking about actually what are we going to do with that? What happens if this happens? Childcare. So not only are we talking about the fact that not all childcare is up and running at the moment, and so for some people it may be difficult for them to return to work because their childcare is not up and running, but the schools are all going back. Fingers crossed everything works out and that there's no spikes and no peaks. But yes, you have a situation where a child, not even your own or your employees, is sick, which then triggers self-isolation for you and your family or your employee's family. How is that going to impact? You know, there's so many. It's, if you think about how many people are involved in that process, it all has a knock-on effect. And then obviously the track and trace process, that is there to try and prevent COVID from spreading. That actually, you know what, one of your employees gets called and says someone that they interacted with, they were in wherever they were, and they've been tested positive, and so now as part of that you will need to self-isolate for a period of time. What is the impact there? Now we need to make sure that your policies and procedures are up to date to try and tackle and challenge any of this, because your employees coming back from furlough, they will ask these questions. And it probably won't be long, unfortunately, before one of them actually encounters one of these situations. So let's, as a business, you want to be ahead of the game and you want to have this information ready in order to share with your furloughed employees on their return. And then lockdown. At the moment, we had a lockdown. What were your procedures? Everything was so reactive. We have now had an opportunity to breathe and to think, right, this is what happened in lockdown. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. If we are to go in lockdown again, this is the process. This is the procedures. This is who we talk to, who manages what process. Where does the workload lie? You have an opportunity to really take the information that we've learned, make it better, and then implement and then put something together, whether it's your SOP or whatever your protocols are, but something in place that means that you can be a bit more proactive should something like that happen again. So being back at work, excellent. You have all your team there, everyone's back at work. Now what is the next steps? Do we just carry on as normal as if nothing happened? I would hope not. A lot's happened this year, and so we still need to be vigilant. We still need to make sure that we're building that confidence and bringing our teams together. So now I'm going to talk through a few other key points around being back at work. The communication does not stop. I said I would talk about communication a lot. Communication is really important. The communication does not stop. They need to understand the business. They need to continue with those updates and have those regular check-ins from their manager. I'll talk about a little bit more about regular check-ins, but we need to make sure that that support is still there. Your employees will come back. For some, it will be very smooth. You'll do the induction process. After a day, they'll be like, oh, it's like old times, and they'll gel straight back in. For others, it may take a little bit more. If you actually have brought people back and you've managed to, and you're having a lot of home working still, or a lot of remote working, you may be having those challenges around managerial support. How do you manage a remote workforce if they haven't been used to that beforehand? So now we need to make sure that that support and that guidance is available, not just to your furloughed employees, but also to your managers, so they still know how they can get information or get that support should they need it. Keep up to date with the government changes. We know that things are changing daily, weekly. What we've said about the travel updates, the health and safety guidance, there's always something new that's coming out. So make sure that you keep that information up to date. Start to change that. It wasn't long when the shops opened, there was no face coverings, and then 2 weeks later we're all wearing face coverings in retail spaces. So there are still changes that keep happening. As this is unprecedented and we are learning as we go, the government is also learning as we go, and it's quite evident by the fact that they continue to change. So we want to make sure that we are ahead of the game on that. So use those websites that Kelly talked about, the the UK Gov website, the ACAS website, because along with any changes, there may also be employment legislation updates and changes. So have that, keep that at the forefront of your mind, even when you've got all of your team back up and running. Those check-ins. Now, it's important to have regular one-to-ones in general business to talk about performance, to keep your team focused, to have that performance discussion. But the crucial element that always seems to be missed, and this was pre-pandemic, and it should be whether there's a pandemic or not, I'm a huge advocate of this, is actually just asking how they are doing and how they are feeling. Having that discussion with your employees. How's it going? Is everything good right now? You can obviously talk about the performance element, the goals, the focus, what the business is doing, updates, workload, the usual kind of performance check-in that you do, but you have an opportunity to keep abreast of what's going on in their lives, their personal circumstances. So you would have had that discussion before they came back from furlough, so you could plan effectively. Now they're back, doesn't mean their personal circumstances is any less valid. You still really need to understand what is happening with their family situation. When someone comes back, it doesn't automatically mean that everything's fine. There may be situations that have changed or things that have happened. And now that you're actually talking to them on a regular basis, they may even open up to you more. Always take the opportunity to seek for those suggestions and that feedback from your team. You know, now that they're back in work, they may have some other ideas. They may think that actually there could be something else you could have done different. There could be things that isn't working or is working, because when you made your plan, when you made your changes, you didn't necessarily have those people in those positions working at that point. Whereas now that they are, there is that opportunity that there may be extra things that could change or that you could do. So have those discussions. Make sure they're regular. Make sure your managers are equipped in order to have these discussions. If one-to-ones was not part of your processes before, and the expectation is that it is going to be going forwards and that you're going to put more emphasis on that, then you want to make sure that your managers are trained and are well aware of the process and actually the discussion element, and actively listening during that process. Well-being. So well-being always seems really interesting to me. So whenever I talk to employees about, do you have a well-being program? I get told, oh yeah, we do yoga once a week. Or actually, even more interestingly, is one of the companies that I work with, they actually put on virtual yoga classes during the pandemic. I love yoga. I'm a huge fan of yoga myself. I practice it, but it's not always just about yoga. Like, as part of a well-being program, yes, activities are great. That whole physical energy, that engagement, it's really, really good, as well as finding like-minded activities. But while you've got your employees back at work, now is your opportunity to really make sure that their well-being is catered for and that you can look after that. if you think about what's happened with the pandemic, with the number of deaths that the COVID has brought, but it's not just about COVID deaths that is something we need to consider. For some people where their family have had significant illnesses, they've ended up being hospitalized and unfortunately died, not everyone has been able to be with those people during that time, which has a knock-on effect to their well-being and how they're feeling. So being able to put a program in place that brings about bereavement support, counseling, it provides a communication outlet for your employees, can add real value to how they feel when they come back to work. So not, like I say, it's not just about yoga, having those activities, but that real communication outlet, which knocks on to mental health support, to have if you look at the news more recently, has been a focus on well-being and what support and what mental health support companies have to offer. Do you have one in place at all? Have you ever even considered one? Now is an opportunity where you can look at it. There's so many more businesses that provide well-being programs, that have those advisory lines. Those advisory lines that it's not just about bereavement, it can also be about financial challenges, residential concerns, legal issues. That's just like literally a phone helpline. Even that can make a difference to your employees, just to be able to offer that process. So take this opportunity to look at what needs and requirements, how many employees do you have in your business will determine how big a program that you may need, and what activities, if you go down the activity line, what activities can you do and can you share? And it's, like I say, it's not always just about the yoga, but it could be reading groups, jogging classes, art classes, or whatever the social element with social distancing requirements involved. But enrichment programs, anything like this that kind of takes the employee away from the working environment mentally helps. So giving them some sort of release, something that they can think about, will help create that work-life balance, which is what you're ultimately aiming for in regards to well-being. So that really brings the end of our session. So we'll have in a moment, we'll go through some questions. I can see that some questions have come through, and I know that Kelly had some questions that we felt were really valid from what our clients have been talking to us about, in order to share with you, so that we potentially will answer some of your questions and give you some more information and insight. But in order to summarize, take this opportunity, if you haven't already done so, to really review your business, look at what it is that you are looking to achieve, and where do your people fit in that scenario. Plan, plan, and plan again. Everything is about planning. You want to have that plan in place. So you have your business plan, you have your people plan, how you're going to bring them back. So we've talked about so many different facets and so many things to think about as part of that process to bring your people back. It can seem complex, but actually when you're talking to the right people and you're getting that expertise, it can make it a lot smoother transition. So communication, we've talked about it so much, but having those conversations with your employees is absolutely 100% crucial. Understanding where they're at, how they're feeling, how they want to come back to work themselves, what their thought process is, can really help you develop this plan for their return. And then ultimately bring your people back. You want them back, you want to set them up for success. Think about that induction process. Think about how you're going to really give that support to your employees, make that smooth transition, have those regular conversations, and before you know it, your team will be all back, and it will be like it was before, maybe with a few changes. You might be on remote working or whatever, but plan for the future. At the moment, everything is starting to look a lot more long term. Probably looking at this going into next year, there doesn't seem to be of any changes, and we are already in September, so this year is absolutely flying by. So continue to plan for the future and bring your team back. So Kelly,
Yeah, so I just really wanted to kind of cover off some kind of real life scenarios as to the kind of questions we've been getting from our clients when they started to bring their staff back. So we've had one particular scenario where we've had an employee who has become pregnant during lockdown. So I'm sure there's lots of occasions of that happening. So the employee has sort of said that they're pregnant, and then they obviously have concerns about coming back into the workplace. Now, as an employer, you are still under an obligation for the health and safety element. So generally when somebody's pregnant, you're under an obligation to ensure the health and safety of that pregnant employee. And that means that you have to make adjustments. Now, with regards to pregnancy and COVID, the preferred response from the employer is that you allow that employee to work from home. Okay, so if it's possible, you allow them to work from home. If it isn't possible for them to do their actual job from home, are there any other jobs that you can redeploy them to on a temporary basis to allow them to work from home? Okay, if you do redeploy them to another job, or you change their job role slightly to allow them to work from home, you need to leave their pay as it is. Okay, so we don't make any adjustments to pay, we just make adjustments to the role that person is doing, and we allow them to work from home. If you're in a scenario where actually you can't allow them to work from home, their job just doesn't allow it, they have to come into the workplace, then what you need to be doing is conducting a very, very thorough risk assessment. Okay, so you need to be doing a risk assessment, looking at what additional PPE they can be provided to ensure their safety, and sort of what social distancing measures you can put in place to ensure their safety and the safety of their unborn child. If you find yourself in a scenario where actually it's going to be impossible to ensure that they're going to be safe, that they feel comfortable, that you feel comfortable as an employer, then what you might have to do, if there are no options to allow them to work from home, is to suspend them on full pay. Okay, so I mean, that's your worst case scenario, but I guess the message here with this scenario is seek advice. Okay, you will potentially be open to sort of paternity and maternity discrimination, so seek advice if you do have pregnant employees that are unable to work from home and you're unable to put sort of safety precautions in place to ensure their safety in the workplace. We've also had questions around, I've got somebody who is refusing to return from furlough, and the employer has done everything that we've suggested. So they've gone and they've had lengthy conversations, and basically they're kind of saying, that there are health issues, this person doesn't have any children, they've just enjoyed having all this time off and being paid 80% of their wage, and they'd like to continue doing that until the end of October. It's not optional. Okay, so as an employer, you can say, no, we need you to return to work, and this is the date that you're returning. Okay, bear in mind before you take this hard line that you've done your exploration, you're fully aware there's nothing going on in the background, there are no health concerns, that you know this person just doesn't want to return to work because they're enjoying their extended holiday. If they get to the point where they don't turn up on the given day that you have asked them to, then you deal with it as you would a normal AWOL situation. Okay, this person is technically AWOL, they should be at work and they're no longer at work. So you then need to revert to contract, revert to policy, and manage it in the same way you would manage any kind of AWOL situation. Again, seek advice. You can get plenty of free advice on this in the ACAS line. But say get advice before you take any action. But in that kind of scenario, you would just revert to your normal AWOL processes and potentially lead down a disciplinary path. Okay. We've also had clients come with questions around flexible furloughs. So they've had staff members who have returned from flexible furlough, and they've sort of been working 3 days a week. And they've sort of said, to the staff member, I need you to come in on Monday. And this person has potentially been working sort of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for the last sort of 4 weeks. And the person says, well, I can't because I've made plans. No, again, it's not optional. Okay. So when you return your staff from furlough, write to them and explain that they're returning from furlough, that you may be taking a flexible approach. However, that person needs to be available for work when requested by you, the employer. Again, it is not optional, okay? But you need to have it in writing to say that you've clearly communicated with this person that they need to be made themselves available for the days they would normally work. Okay, so if they work Monday to Friday, then Monday to Friday you have the ability to call on them to return to work. It's not an optional stance. Okay. We have also had questions around redundancy. So very much around how people can, I suppose, take advantage, utilise the sort of the job retention scheme when it comes to things like notice pay, notice periods. Okay. Yes, you can is the upshot of this. However, you really do need to think about the kind of the time frames of this, and you're very quickly, if you kind of left it to this point in the day, you are really sort of leaving it a little bit close to the bone. Okay, you do need to consider, as I sort of touched on at the beginning of our talk, you know, it's consultation processes that you need to enter into. So even if it's one person that you're making redundant, you know, you need to consider that you need to demonstrate a reasonable consultation process. So you need to factor that in. Then you sort of go to the point of, okay, issuing notice, and then depending on what that notice is. Obviously, if their notice period does fall within the remainder of furlough and they're still furloughed, then you can use that money, but obviously you need to top up to 100% of their salary, and that's whether that's contractual or statutory notice. You need to be topping it up to 100% of their salary. Okay. But as I say, really think about you know, your timelines here, because if you are talking about larger groups of people, you need to observe those sort of 30-day or 45-day consultation processes, and then obviously observing individuals' notice periods, and it's a statutory notice that supersedes their contractual notice. So if somebody has, you know, 13, 14 years service, then you're looking at 12 weeks notice. Okay, so you really need to be, you know, if you haven't already, moving on that now. Another question that we've been getting asked is around travel. So again, you know, can I bring my employees back, and can I expect them to travel? That again is your judgment call on what essential travel is in relation to that person's job role. But you really do need to be conducting, I guess, risk assessments, and assessing, you know, what is essential travel, and, you know, where is this person going? Are they going to be using public transport? Are you going to be providing hire cars if they don't have their own car? Are they going to be travelling with colleagues? So again, all this is something that you need to think about and factor. When they get to their destination, are they going to be staying overnight? Where are they going to be staying? You know, is the accommodation that you're booking for them, do they have the correct protocols in place? Then we need to be thinking about, okay, is there going to be things like catering facilities available in these hotels? How are you going to feed your staff? Because if they're away working, that responsibility does lie on you to make sure that this person is going to be safe and they're going to have the facilities that they need. So my advice would be to conduct, you know, risk assessment and think about that whole process, you know, and when they get to their destination, if they're going to be on your sites, on client sites, on building sites, you know, what are the protocols that are in place to keep that person safe? Because ultimately it is your responsibility. If you're telling this person that they have to travel, that they're putting themselves at risk, that you are making sure as an employer you are mitigating those risks as much as possible. If again, you know, you get somebody who says, well, I don't feel safe traveling, again, you need to explore those reasons with them and try to reassure them as much as possible. But ultimately, if somebody really doesn't feel safe traveling, you may have to kind of pull back and say, okay, do you know what, we can make temporary adjustments to your role. Or you may have to play a hard line to say, okay, no, we need you to do this. But again, you need to weigh up, you know, either side of that conversation and really listen to them and the reasons for that. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end. I don't know if there's any kind of scenarios that you wanted to cover off, Gina, or if I've pretty much captured everything.
Yes, you've pretty much captured everything.
Okay, great. So if there are any questions that we've had come through. Oh, we can't hear you. Can't hear you. Oh, there we go.
That's it. Forgot the button. I'm going to make a suggestion now. We just have a couple of minutes, very quick break to allow people to put any question in. So if we just come back in sort of 5 minutes, just gives people a bit of chance for questions to come in. A couple have come in at the moment, so so if we come back in 5 minutes, and we'll go through any questions.
Yep, okay, then that's great. Cheers.
Okay.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions starting to come through. So I'm just going to start off with the first one, and it's to do with masks.
Yeah.
What happens if an employee refuses to wear a mask while at work? Masks are not mandatory, but we as a company want all staff to wear masks.
Okay, my advice would be on this one is, first of all, you know, have a look at your risk assessments. You've conducted a risk assessment. You know, there are obviously measures that you need to put in place around social distancing and, you know, the wearing of PPE if social distancing isn't possible. And if your preference is that people wear a mask, then, you know, you need to write that in, and the reasons why. I think this is really important. The communications of why you're asking people to do certain things in relation to health and safety. Okay. Secondly, you then need to talk to the individual and understand why they don't want to wear a mask. If it's for a health reason, you need to explore that and understand what the impact is going to be there. If it's you know, they believe it's interfering in their job role or their ability to perform their job role, you kind of need to understand and listen and say, okay, what's going on here? If it's that they're flatly just refusing to because they've decided that you just want to go against the grain and they're going to be difficult, then that ultimately may be a different conversation. I think the difficulty with all of this is that we're in unprecedented times. It's very difficult to kind of give you a hypothetical answer. It really depends on how these conversations play out with the individual. But my advice at this point would be, you know, go back to them, really understand why they're refusing to wear that face mask, but at the same time, really have it kind of laid out very clearly as to why you want them to wear that face mask, and, you know, in relation to risk assessments and the kind of the measures that you within your business are putting in place to keep everybody safe. So you kind of need the two, and then it's going to be a lot of conversation and a balancing act. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. The next one is, if an employee says they have symptoms but are known to be likely to be faking this, what can we do?
I'll take this one. So it's very difficult to be able to understand whether someone is faking their symptoms or not. Obviously, when someone is calling in sick, they have to get one of those doctors a GP note or something, or a 111 note to say that they are unfit or unhealthy to be out, unable to attend work. So I would still be requesting that information. My advice would be to ask them for that information if they are showing symptoms, and also encouraging them to go through a test. You know, you can't make a test mandatory and demand that they go, but if anyone at all is showing any symptoms, we should be encouraging them to take the test to see if they are positive or not, because ultimately you will want to know that information for your business, because you will also need to put measures in place potentially as to what that outcome potentially could be with a positive result. So have the conversation with them and explain to them the protocols in terms of they need to go and get that GP sick note and fit, and then ultimately a fit to return note as well.
And I think as well, it's probably worth just adding, you know, you should be managing any kind of COVID related absence in the same way you would your normal absence policy. So if you do have somebody who, you know, you're on third time around and they're phoning up and saying, I have to self-isolate, you know, they're either extremely unlucky or there is something else going on and they're taking advantage. But either way, your absence policy in itself should reflect something that says, you know, if you have 3 or more absences, or if your absence, you know, goes above this ratio, we're going to have a review with you. So you should be challenging people and having that conversation, sort of saying, okay, what's going on? You know, because you don't have to put up with it. So you can manage it, but you do need to follow a process. So do make sure you're following your absence management processes. But as Gina said, it's very much, you know, if somebody is showing symptoms of COVID-19 and they're sort of reporting into you and sort of saying, oh, I'm going to be absent for the next 2 weeks, in order for them to qualify for sick pay, they need to have produced a note from the GP or the 111 service. And so if they're having to do that every time, you know, at some point, someone along the line is going to sort of say, well, this is getting a bit ridiculous. So just make sure you follow your sort of absence reporting processes.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about having those review meetings about any absence, because what you'll find is people will not like, your employees will not like to sit in front of you and justify why they've been off sick again for the 3rd time in a month. That process will start to become uncomfortable and they will not want to do it. So it's a good prevention factor too.
We've actually got a couple of questions come in based upon that, I think, following on from that one. The one is about, I'm just trying to read it as we speak. The one is saying, so a staff absence after the 72 hours for the test, if they can't produce a note, would be unauthorized. I think they're getting at the time period for the test to take place. After that, if they can't produce something, then it would be an unauthorized absence. Is that? I think that's
So
what they're trying to
I think it. Okay, so you have somebody who is phoned up and they say, okay, I'm showing symptoms of COVID-19. I need to self-isolate for 14 days. And as an employer, you say, right, okay, please can you provide us with a GP note or a 111 note to confirm that you've reported those symptoms and that you need to self-isolate. You cannot pay that person SSP until you have that note anyway. Okay, so that's sort of point one. You have to have that to pay that person SSP. Okay, if that person cannot produce that note, you then sort of say, okay, well, who's asked you to self-isolate? These are the kind of questions. Who has told you that you need to self-isolate? Is it your GP? Is it 111? Is it track and trace? You know, have you just come back from traveling and you need to quarantine? So you need to understand why this person is self-isolating. If they sort of say, oh, well, I just feel a little bit unwell and I just think I might have symptoms, then you need to signpost them. Well, no, you need to go and speak to a GP, or you need to contact 111, or, you know, you need to go and get yourself tested. So there will be something tangible that they can do and produce for you. When you sort of talk about unauthorized absence, if they've reported saying that they're sick, it's not an unauthorized absence. That person is absent because they're telling you they're sick. What you need to do is manage that. So you would record it as a sickness absence. If somebody has sort of 3 episodes of an absence, sort of saying, 3 different occasions I've phoned in and said I'm sick, then you'd sort of sit them down and say, okay, look, there's a pattern occurring here. You seem to be sick every other week or every week, and then you'd explore that with them. You wouldn't necessarily say it's unauthorized. It would just depend on whether or not you're going to pay them for the absence or whether it's recorded as a sickness absence, if that makes sense. I don't know anything you want to add to that, Gina.
No, you covered it. But yeah, it'll end up being unpaid absence, unpaid sickness absence if they can't provide the paperwork.
But it will still be sickness absence, and you still have to manage it within an absence process.
Yeah.
So you should revert to your absence policies and kind of look and say, okay, how does that say that we're going to deal with an absent employee? If you don't have an absence policy, then again, it sort of pulls back on what's reasonable. So sitting down and having a conversation with the employee and sort of saying, look, you've phoned in 3 different times with, these symptoms. What's going on? Something's not quite right here. We need to explore what's happening. How are you deciding that you need to isolate? What's been the trigger here? And really exploring that with them. If it continues and they continue to have this absence, which is basically unacceptable levels of absence, then potentially you're looking at, a misconduct issue. If there's no, real reason behind it, and then you'd potentially sort of move to I guess, remove them or sort of terminate their employment contract, because, unacceptable levels of attendance. But you need to have followed a process before you get to that point, especially if they have more than 2 years service.
This is, we spoke already in the presentation about updating your absence policy and your sickness policy. And if these sort of scenarios, this is something else that you can look to really make that absence policy really robust in order to cover off these scenarios and give that guidance to the employees as to what they need to do should they have symptoms, or what's sick notes and how they get statutory sick pay. All of that information should be in your absence policy.
I guess another one which is sort of, I guess, following on from this is, can I refuse somebody to come back into the workplace without a test?
Why? I guess this is the thing of, so are they saying that?
I'm guessing they got somebody who's probably got symptoms and refusing to take a test. That's how I'm reading it here.
So is this before, or I suppose my first question would be, is this before or after the 14-day isolation period? Or have they self-isolated for 14 days already and refused a test? Or are they wanting to self-isolate for 14 days and we've requested the test? I suppose there's a lot of different variables that could come into that scenario. So it's quite difficult to kind of try and give blanket advice on that, I think.
Yeah. I think it's kind of need to know a little bit more.
I think it's probably a case-by-case basis on that one, and to seek further advice.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely would suggest that.
I think this is the final question we've got now is, how do I deal with staff who are shielding?
In relation to
I'm assuming for returning back to work, because shielding has changed, I think, now, hasn't it? So people who are shielding can return back to work. So I'm assuming that this person's got staff who may have been shielding in the past, or whether they can return back to work.
The key will be having those conversations, understand that personal circumstance conversation that we talked about, to really understand how they're feeling and how long they've been shielding, and whether they've had additional guidance from their GP or from the medical team that they're dealing with to actually say they still need to continue to shielding. Because the shielding situation, people have started to come out from that scenario. So again, we really probably need to go on a case-by-case basis, but understanding what the situation is for that individual and how they're feeling and what their personal circumstances will help you to come up to a workable solution.
And I think as well, if you're in any doubt, as with any kind of health scenarios, ask that employee and get the permission to contact their GP or refer them to occupational health, so that you've got that advice that kind of says from a medical point of view, this is what they should or should not be doing. Because they're obviously with the whole shielding piece is that fear of disability discrimination. If somebody does have a long-term condition, that's ultimately what the risk is as an employer. So it is really just trying to get as much information as you can, and if possible, get the permission from that individual to contact their GP to really understand, well, okay, these are the measures that we've put in place within our workplace. Is this sufficient enough to bring them back? But again, it might be as simple as just having that conversation with the individual, just to reassure them that they feel safe, and that if there are any particular increased social distancing measures or additional PPE that they need to make sure that they feel safe, then it's just sort of going through that process. But if you are in any doubt, my advice would be to revert to the way you would normally deal with kind of any health issues, and that's seek advice from occupational health or the person's GP, to really sort of give you pointers on what you should be doing or expecting of that person.
Yeah, I've got a little bit more information just come through on that one, actually, and it's to do with the furlough, and do I have to pay the 10% top up if they are unable to return to work because their GP says they have to shield? So will it still be on the full 80%, or will they be on that flexible furlough with the 70% and 10% via the business having to pay?
They would still, so if they've been furloughed for all of this time and they're saying that they have a letter that says that they need to continue on furlough till the end of October, then it still needs to remain as per the furlough scheme. Is that what they're asking? I
think so, yeah. I think, is there any dispensation for people who are having to shield on the furlough scheme to keep furlough payments at full 80%? So has any is there any dispensation for people who are having to shield on furlough at all?
So
I think that's the
80%, everybody remains on 80%. So the employer would still need to top it up as they would with everybody else. So the government element of this, you know, their contribution is dropping down, but as an employer, you now have to start contributing. So regardless, that person would still receive 80%, but the difference comes in September and October is that as an employer, you now need to contribute. So you would need to make a contribution.
It doesn't matter that they're shielding if they still have to stay on furlough, is I think what they're trying to get at.
I think so, yeah. I think it's the case of the government will pay the 70%, the business will have to pay the 10%, even though they're unable to return to work because they're shielding. I think that's what they're trying to get at on that one. I think that's all the questions we've got. Certainly some questions there which I think are very specific to individual needs. And what I will say at this point is, if anybody wants any further advice, please do contact the Humber Growth Hub. There is provision for further one-to-one support. And certainly if you've got those very specific questions, a lot of them are very much case-by-case basis and will need looking at with a lot more information. So please do get in contact and seek that additional advice. I'm sure Kelly and Gina will be more than happy to have a look at that and go through those on that one-to-one basis. The other thing I'll mention here is we have a number of other workshops that are coming up, so please do again have a look at the Humber Growth Hub website to see the other workshops we've got coming up. There are a number of those coming up, all sort of based around similar sort of topics and lots of other topics as well. One this afternoon, a couple next week as well. So do have a look at those, get yourself booked on and see what's available. So again, thank you very much for an informative session, and certainly given those very detailed answers to those questions. Say a lot of those I think need a lot of information in terms of being able to answer very specific questions there. So thank you very much. And as I say, do have a look at the Humber Growth Hub website to see what else is available. But thank you very much for attending. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.